Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Ask Dave. And today's question was really very simple. A viewer asks, what is a cadenza? He's having problems figuring out what it is and when it happens and what it does and why it does and all of those questions. And it's a very good question because like all terms in our musical life, it's meant different things at different times and can take many different forms and shapes depending on the era and style of the music. But let's start with the most general definition. A cadenza is any improvised passage that the performer adds to the work, hopefully based on the themes of the work, if the performer knows what they're doing. It can be of any length. It can be in any style. It can be horrible and vulgar and tasteless. It can be incredibly virtuosic. It can be soft and contemplative. The point is, historically, that it was improvised. The composer didn't write it down. He left the performer to do something. And in order to leave the performer to do something, he had to write the music in such a way so that there was a natural break where the performer could insert their cadenza. Now, technically speaking, cadenzas are improvised, but in reality, composers and performers, first performers, later composers, tended to write them down or write down various options that people could select, because actually simply winging it like jazz performers so often do is not easy. And it can go terribly, terribly wrong. And as I've heard in several jazz performances, sometimes they get going and they just keep going and they don't know when to stop. And it overbalances the structure of the movement by being too big or too, there's all kinds of things that can happen. But the bottom line, what you need to know, is that it's simply an improvised solo passage. And anywhere, anything that's not written down, that's what it is. And the fact that performers and composers started writing them down does not change the fact that we still call these things cadenzas, because they go where the cadenza spot in the composition. Now, in most compositions, in the classical period, the cadenza occurs towards the end of the movement, after the solo and the orchestra have done many exchanges and interchanges and interactions, and its purpose is to counterbalance the long orchestral introduction when the soloist is not playing. In classical sonata form, in classical concerto form, the orchestra introduces the main themes, then the solo comes in, and they work together for a while. And so to balance out this big, long processional orchestral introduction, the solo gets an extra thing at the very end of the movement. Now, normally speaking, the cadenza will be introduced by a harmonic formula. They'll be playing along, the orchestra and the solo and whatnot, and then the orchestra will take off and come to a full stop. And the stop is on what we call in music theory a 6/4 chord, 6/4 tonic chord, if you want to be extra detailed, or a tonic chord in the second inversion, if you want to be even more detailed. What this means is that you're in your home key, and normally you're going to end with a nice, beautiful chord in your home key that signifies, we've made it, it's over. And when you invert that chord and put the upper note in the bass and spread it out differently on top, you get a very different sound. It's, yes, we're almost home, but we're not quite. It's a little bit unstable. And as a result, the solo comes in, and the musical purpose of this solo is to try and work its way around, visiting all of the themes we've heard so far, back to our home key and tonic chord in its root position, and the stable and most satisfying ending form. Now, you don't need to know any more about the theory than that, and you may or may not hear it. And I understand why it's very difficult sometimes to tell whether you're in a cadenza or not, because there are plenty of solos in a concerto or in an aria, for example. I mean, there are vocal cadenzas too. your solo is always doing something. Sometimes they're accompanied, sometimes they're not, and then all of a sudden you're in a cadenza. Well, there's no way to really know that it's the cadenza unless it really is improvised, and you know that's what they're doing. And most of the time we don't, because we're just listening. We're not watching if we listen on recordings. But if you are listening to a classical concerto, you will hear that harmonic formula that says, ha ha, cadenza. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to give you an example of one. This is from Mozart's 20th Piano Concerto on Naxos with Jeno Jando and Concertos Hungarius and Andras Ligeti, conductor. And you will hear, I'm giving you the last solo played, accompanied by the orchestra, and then the orchestra all on its own doing some sort of angry wrap up, the pause, and then you'll hear about 2 minutes, 2 solid minutes of solo piano that leads eventually back to the orchestra coming in. And by the way, these cadenza will usually end with a trill. And then the orchestra comes back in. And that's what happens here. Now, this particular cadenza is actually by Beethoven. It's one of the most famous of all composer commentaries on the work of another composer. Mozart also wrote his own cadenzas for his concerti. There's a whole book of them that you can pick from. Some of them are very good. Some of them are very perfunctory. But the bottom line is that they all have in common this idea that the orchestra pauses and the solo does at this point, quasi-improvisational, because it's written down by Beethoven, fantasia on the themes of the concerto thus far. So here's the whole passage. It's like 3 and a bit minutes long. We're going to go all the way to the end of the movement. Here you go. Now, every single Mozart concerto and Beethoven concerto is going to do just that, what you just heard. It's going to come to a pause, the solo is going to do its thing, and then the movement's going to wrap up. Now, the Beethoven was actually the guy who eliminated the virtuoso cadenza, the improvised cadenza, in his fifth piano concerto, the Emperor Concerto, where he writes, at that point, everything happens the way it's supposed to. There's the pause, the chord, the whole deal, or the chord and the pause. But then he writes a little note. It says, do not make a cadenza, but rather proceed with the following. And then he writes out a whole passage that leads back, without the trill, by the way, to the rest of the to the return of the orchestra and the ending of the movement. After Beethoven, and before, by the way, in the Baroque period too, it wasn't as formulaic. It wasn't as standardized, the idea of the cadenza and where it happens, because the forms were different. The first movement form was different. You don't have to worry about what those are. You just have to know that when you have extended solo parts, you may or may not be in a cadenza, especially if it's toward the end of the movement. One of the most famous and longest of all cadenzas occurs in the first movement of Bach's Fifth Brandenburg Concerto. It's for solo harpsichord or piano, whatever the keyboard instrument is, but harpsichord in Bach's day. And it's a huge mother. It's not prepared the way a classical concerto does it, with the chord and the pause. What happens is the orchestral texture just sort of evaporates, leaving the keyboard solo, and then it just goes off for like hours. It's fascinating and brilliant and wonderful. After Beethoven in the Romantic period, you sometimes had composers who left an opportunity for an improvised cadenza or a composed cadenza by the dedicatee of the work in question. Brahms, for example, in his violin concerto, it was composed for Joseph Joachim, who was a tremendous composer and violinist all by himself. And so Brahms left a gap where Joachim could write his own cadenza, and he did. And his cadenza is often performed with the concerto, or another violinist composer like Fritz Kreisler. And so if you buy recordings, you'll often see a little note under a movement that says cadenzas by boopity boop, and it will tell you who wrote the cadenza, or where they got it from. And sometimes performers today will still improvise their own, or write them down, or some combination of the two things, depending on who the performer is. The cadenza in later music does not have to occur in the first movement. It doesn't have to occur at the end of the first movement. It can occur between movements that are connected. For example, Shostakovich, in his first violin concerto and his first cello concerto, writes enormous cadenzas for the soloist alone after the slow movement in each case. And those cadenzas are so large, they're 4 or 5 minutes long, that they get tracked separately on most recordings. They're viewed as separate movements, complete in and of themselves, but they are technically cadenzas. The word itself, in case you were wondering, comes from cadence. Cadence is a passage that concludes a musical sentence or paragraph or section. It's a harmonic formula that, like, for example, happy birthday to you. That's a cadence. God save the king. That's a cadence. It's a formula that brings a larger thing, a musical statement, to a satisfying conclusion. And the cadenza became the bridge between the approach to that thing and the actual arrival at that thing. It's a postponement of the long anticipated and desired satisfying ending. So I hope this answers your question. It's not always easy to know when you're hearing a cadenza, like I said, and sometimes nowadays they're written down to the point where the term has very little meaning. It just means a big, long solo passage. But there was a point where it was something rather more specific, and I've just given you a taste, I think, of what that thing was. And I hope this answers your question and helps you in listening, and also takes a little of the anxiety away. Don't worry whether it's a cadenza or not a cadenza. It's a solo. It's going to be a solo. Some solos are cadenzas, some aren't. You can call it that. Some people might dispute that. It's not a big deal. It really isn't, but it's nice to know. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.